June 6, 1944, before the first bullet hit, before the first explosion broke the silence, there was a moment where everything felt still. The English Channel stretched out under a gray sky, and hundreds of landing craft moved slowly across the water, carrying thousands of men toward a place they had never seen but already feared. Inside those boats, there was no shouting, no last-minute speeches, no heroic energy like the movies would later show. There was something quieter, something heavier, the kind of silence that comes when every man knows that in a few minutes his life might end and there is nothing he can do to change it. The soldiers stood packed together, their equipment weighing down their bodies, rifles pressed tightly against their chests, boots wet from the water that leaked into the boat. The air smelled like fuel salt and fear. Some men stared at the floor, some looked straight ahead. Without blinking, others closed their eyes, not to sleep, but to avoid thinking. Because once you start thinking in that moment, your mind begins to imagine everything that can go wrong. And once that happens, it becomes harder to stay in control. They had trained for this moment for months. They knew the plan, they knew the sequence, they knew exactly what they were supposed to do when the ramp dropped. Move forward, find cover, push inland. But there is a difference between knowing something and experiencing it, and no amount of training can fully prepare the human mind for what happens when the abstract idea of danger becomes real. As the boats moved closer to the shore, the sound started to change. At first it was distant, like thunder far away. Then it became sharper, louder, more defined. Machine gun fire, artillery shells, explosions, hitting the water and sending waves crashing into the sides of the boats. The closer they got, the more intense it became, until it was no longer something happening somewhere else. It was happening here now, around them, and there was no turning back. The first wave reached the beach, and the front of the boats dropped. Men rushed forward, but many did not even make it into shallow water before they were hit. Bullets cut across the surface of the ocean, striking bodies before they could react, turning what should have been a path forward into a barrier of death. Those behind them saw it happen in real time. They saw what was waiting for them before they even stepped out. When the next boats arrived, the soldiers inside already knew what they were walking into, and that knowledge changed everything. Because fear is different when it is unknown, but when you can see exactly what is about to happen, your brain begins to process it in a completely different way. It is no longer a possibility, it becomes an expectation. The ramp dropped again, and men jumped out. Some tried to run, others tried to stay low. Some did not even get the chance to move, because the moment their boots touched the water, they were hit. But in the middle of all this chaos, something else began to appear, something that did not make sense at first, and did not fit into any plan or strategy. Some soldiers did not react at all. They stepped out of the boat, or they reached the sand, and then they stopped, not crouching, not running, not firing back, just standing or kneeling or lying still, as if the connection between their mind and body had been cut. Their eyes were open, their breathing continued, but their ability to act was gone. This was not a rare moment. It happened again and again across different sections of the beach. Soldiers who had survived the initial landing suddenly found themselves unable to move, even though everything around them demanded action. Officers shouted commands telling them to get down, to move forward, to find cover. But some of those commands were never followed, not because the soldiers refused, but because they could not respond. And this is where the story begins to change, because up until that point, everything about D-Day could be explained by strategy, by planning, by numbers, by firepower. But this moment, this sudden stillness, could not be explained in the same way. It was not part of the battle plan. It was not something anyone had trained for. To understand what was happening, you have to step inside the experience of those soldiers, not as heroes, not as units in a larger operation, but as individuals standing in a place where every sense was overloaded, every sound was amplified, every movement carried the possibility of death, and every second forced the brain to process more information than it was designed to handle. Imagine stepping into that water, feeling the weight of your equipment pulling you down, hearing bullets hit the surface around you, seeing men fall before they can take a second step, trying to focus on what you are supposed to do while your brain is flooded with signals telling you that everything around you is dangerous and that survival is not guaranteed. Now imagine that instead of choosing to move or to fight, your brain simply stops choosing at all. Because that is what happened to many of those soldiers on that beach. They did not decide to freeze. Their brain reached a point where decision-making itself shut down. And when that happens, the body follows. Time begins to feel different. Moments stretch longer than they should. Sounds become distant, or distorted. Vision narrows or blurs. The connection between thought and action weakens until it disappears completely. From the outside, it looks like hesitation or fear or even cowardice, but from the inside, it feels like nothing. No panic, no movement, no reaction. Just stillness. And in a place like Omaha Beach, stillness was deadly, because the battle did not pause. The gunfire continued, the explosions continued, the soldiers around them continued to move or fall or fight. But for those who froze, the world became disconnected from their ability to interact with it, and that is the part of D-Day that is rarely talked about. Not the landing, not the strategy, not the victory, but the moment when the human mind reached its limit, and some soldiers simply could not go any further. And the question that follows is not just what happened on that beach, but why it happened at all. What happened on Omaha Beach was not just a failure of movement, it was a failure of the mind under pressure. And to understand it, you have to go deeper than the surface of the battle. Because what those soldiers experienced was not simply fear, it was overload. The human brain is designed to process information, but it is not designed to handle everything at once. And on that beach, everything happened at once. The sound of gunfire did not come from one direction, it came from everywhere. The explosions did not happen in sequence, they overlapped. Without pause, the visual field was filled with movement, bodies, falling waves, crashing smoke rising, and every one of those signals demanded attention at the same time. Under normal conditions, the brain filters information. It decides what matters and what does not. It focuses on one thing, then moves to the next. But in extreme conditions, that system breaks down, the brain stops filtering and begins receiving everything equally, which creates a state where nothing stands out clearly enough to act upon in that moment. The ability to make decisions slows down, and when the pressure continues to increase, decision-making can stop completely. This is where the third response appears. The one that is rarely talked about. Fight and run are the responses everyone knows, but freeze is the one that is least understood. It is not a conscious choice, it is not something a person decides to do, it is automatic, and it happens when the brain reaches a level of stress that it cannot process in real time. Instead of choosing an action, it pauses everything in an attempt to protect itself from collapse. On Omaha Beach, this response was triggered again and again because the environment created the perfect conditions for overload. The soldiers were exposed to constant threat without any moment to recover. There was no clear front line, no safe zone, no break in the intensity. The brain never had the chance to reset, and when that happens, the internal systems begin to fail. Some soldiers described the experience as if time had slowed down, while others said it felt like time had stopped completely. The movement around them became unclear, as if they were watching through a layer of fog. Commands were heard but not understood, or understood but not followed. The connection between hearing and action weakened until it disappeared. Others described a sense of detachment where they felt separated from their own body, as if they were observing themselves instead of controlling themselves. This is another response to extreme stress, where the brain creates distance between the individual and the experience as a way to reduce the impact of what is happening. What makes this more complex is that training does not eliminate this response. Training can delay it, training can reduce the chances of it happening early, but it cannot remove it completely, because it is built into the structure of the brain itself. Every human carries this response, whether they are aware of it or not. The soldiers who did not freeze were not immune. They were operating under the same conditions, exposed to the same stress, but their threshold had not yet been reached, or they found a way to keep moving despite the overload. Sometimes this came from focus on a single task, sometimes from following another soldier, sometimes from pure momentum. But even those who continued to move were not unaffected. The stress was still there, building with every second. And this is why the beach became more than a physical battlefield. It became a psychological test where each individual faced the limits of their own mind. Some reached that limit quickly, others held on longer, but everyone was moving toward the same point where the brain would begin to struggle. In that environment, small differences mattered. A moment of hesitation, a slight delay in reaction, a brief loss of focus. These were not just minor issues, they were critical, because the speed of the battle did not allow for recovery. If a soldier froze at the wrong moment, there was no time to correct it. This created a situation where survival was not only about skill or courage, but about mental endurance, the ability to continue functioning when the brain is overwhelmed, the ability to act when the natural response is to stop. And yet, even with that understanding, there is something deeper that needs to be recognized, because the freeze response is not simply a failure, it is a signal. It It shows that the brain has reached a level of stress that it cannot safely process, which means that what those soldiers experienced on that beach was not just intense, it was beyond what the human mind is normally capable of handling. This changes the way the event should be viewed, because it was not just a test of military strength, it was a test of human capacity, a point where the demands of the environment exceeded the limits of the system designed to handle it. And when that happens, the result is not always action. Sometimes the result is stillness. And on that beach, stillness was everywhere, even if it was only for a few seconds at a time. Those seconds were enough to decide outcomes not just for individuals, but for entire sections of the battlefield. Because when enough soldiers slow down or stop, the movement of the whole unit is affected. And once that happens, the structure of the plan begins to break apart. This is how psychological pressure becomes a physical force in battle. It changes behavior, which changes movement, which changes outcomes, and it does all of this without being seen directly. You cannot see a brain shutting down from the outside. You only see the result. A soldier standing still in a place where everything demands movement. And that is what made Omaha Beach different from anything those men had experienced before. Because it was not just the enemy that they were fighting, it was the limit of their own mind. What makes Omaha Beach different from most stories of war is not only what happened, but how it happened at the level of individual experience. Because when you move away from maps and strategies and look at the ground itself, the battle begins to change shape. It is no longer a coordinated operation. It becomes a series of disconnected moments where each soldier is forced to respond to a reality that is moving faster than the mind can follow. As the landing continued, the beach became more crowded, not with organized movement, but with scattered groups of men. Trying to find direction under constant fire obstacles covered the shoreline, steel barriers, wire entanglements, hidden mines, and the remains of earlier waves that had not made it forward. Each step required attention, each movement required calculation, but there was no time to calculate because the threat was immediate and continuous. Some soldiers reached the sand and dropped, instantly searching for any form of cover, even if it was nothing more than a slight dip in the ground. Others tried to push forward, but found themselves exposed with no clear path through the defenses. The environment itself worked against them, forcing them into positions where hesitation could not be corrected. It is in these moments that the freeze response became most visible, not as a single dramatic event, but as a pattern that repeated across the beach. A soldier would move, then stop, then attempt to move again and fail to follow through. The body would begin an action, but not complete it, as if the signal from the brain was interrupted before it reached its target. One account describes a soldier who stepped over the side of his landing craft and stood in waist-deep water holding his weapon at chest level. He did not raise it, he did not lower it, he simply held it in place while everything around him continued to move. Another soldier reached the sand and remained crouched in the same position. Even as the situation around him changed, he could see the movement, he could hear the commands, but he could not convert that awareness into action. This is not the kind of behavior that fits into traditional descriptions of fear. It is not panic, it is not retreat, it is a form of paralysis where intention exists but execution does not follow. The mind is active, but the connection to the body is disrupted. What makes this even more complex is that these moments were often temporary. Some soldiers who froze would suddenly regain movement without any clear trigger. They would shift from complete stillness to rapid action, as if a switch had been turned back on. Others did not recover in time. And the difference between those outcomes often came down to seconds. Those seconds determined whether a soldier remained part of the battle or became part of the landscape of the beach. There is also the effect of observation. Because soldiers were not isolated, they could see each other, and in extreme conditions, behavior spreads. When one person hesitates, others notice, and that hesitation can influence the group not as a conscious decision, but as a subtle shift in rhythm. Movement slows, coordination weakens, and the structure of the unit begins to break apart. Commanders on the beach faced a different kind of challenge, because the issue was not only physical resistance from the enemy, but the internal resistance within their own ranks. Orders could be given, but they were not always received or acted upon in the expected way, which created a gap between intention and outcome. This gap is where the battle became unpredictable, because once the connection between command and action is disrupted, the flow of the operation changes. Plans depend on timing and coordination, and when those elements begin to fail, the entire system becomes unstable. And yet within that, Instability there were also moments of recovery. Small groups would form around individuals who managed to keep moving. A single soldier taking action could create a point of focus for others, providing direction in a situation where direction had been lost. This is how movement returned, not through the original plan, but through local moments of leadership and adaptation. But even in those moments, the underlying pressure did not disappear. The stress remained constant, and the risk of mental overload remained present, which means that the line between action and stillness was always close and could be crossed at any time. This is what defines the experience of those who were on that beach. It was not a steady progression from landing to advance. It was a continuous fluctuation between movement and pause, between control and loss of control, where each individual had to navigate not only the external threats, but also the internal limits of their own capacity. And this is why the question of why some soldiers never left the beach cannot be answered by looking only at what was in front of them. You have to consider what was happening inside them, because in many cases the barrier was not the enemy position or the physical obstacles, but the moment when the mind reached its limit and could not push further. When that point is reached, the outcome is not decided by training or intention. It is decided by whether the mind can continue to function under conditions that are beyond what it was designed to handle. And on that day, for many soldiers, that limit was reached on the sand before they could take another step. By the time the day moved toward its later hours, the shape of the battle had changed, not because the intensity had reduced, but because those who were still able to move had found ways to adapt. Small groups pushed forward, using whatever cover they could find, not following the original plan, but creating a new one in real time. The shoreline that had once been a barrier slowly became a point of transition where movement began to replace stillness. But even as the advance continued, the evidence of what had happened earlier remained visible across the beach. Bodies were scattered across the sand, some where they had fallen in the first seconds of the landing, others in positions that showed they had tried to move and could not. Equipment lay abandoned, not because it was dropped in panic, but because the connection between intention and action had broken at the wrong moment. When the battle is viewed from a distance, it becomes easy to describe it in terms of success and progress. Lines were established, defenses were broken, ground was taken. But when the same event is viewed at the level of individual experience, a different picture appears, one where the outcome was not only shaped by strategy, but by the limits of human capacity. After the war, military analysts tried to understand these moments not as isolated incidents, but as part of a larger pattern. They studied reports, they collected personal accounts, and they began to see that the freeze response was not rare. It had appeared in multiple battles under similar conditions: high stress, continuous threat, lack of clear direction, and no opportunity for recovery. This led to changes in training methods. Soldiers were exposed to controlled stress environments designed to simulate the pressure of combat, not to remove the response, but to push the threshold further, so that the point of shutdown would occur later rather than sooner. But even with these changes, one fact remained constant: the response could not be eliminated because it is built into the structure of the brain itself. This creates a reality that is difficult to accept, because it means that in any extreme situation there is always a point where the mind may stop functioning as expected, not because of weakness, not because of failure, but because the system has reached its limit. On Omaha Beach, that limit was reached by many men at the same time, which is why the phenomenon became so visible. It was not hidden, it was not rare, it was part of the experience of the landing itself. And this changes the way the event should be remembered, because the story is not only about those who moved forward, it is also about those who could not. The difference between them is not always explained by courage or skill. It is often explained by timing, by thresholds, by how much stress the mind could process in that exact moment. For those who recovered from the freeze, the memory did not disappear. Many carried it with them long after the battle ended, not as a moment of failure, but as a moment of understanding where they experienced the boundary of their own control. For those who did not recover, the outcome became permanent, not because they chose to stop, but because they could not continue. This is the part of D-Day that does not appear in simplified versions of history. It is not a story that fits easily into narratives of victory or heroism, because it reveals something more complex about the nature of human response under extreme conditions. It shows that even in moments of large-scale conflict, the outcome is shaped by small internal events happening inside each individual mind. A decision not made, a movement not completed, a second that passes without action. And those small events combine to create the larger result that history records. Because war is not only a clash of forces, it is a collection of human experiences, each one shaped by perception, by stress, by the ability or inability to act. And when the mind reaches its limit, the body follows, not forward, but into stillness. That stillness is not always visible from a distance, but on that beach, it was everywhere, even if only for a moment. And for some, that moment was enough to define the outcome, not just of the battle, but of their entire experience within it. Which is why the question remains important, not only for understanding what happened on that day, but for understanding how humans respond when pushed beyond what they were built to handle. Because the most dangerous point in any conflict is not always where the fire is strongest. It is where the mind can no longer keep up. And in that moment, the difference between movement and stillness becomes everything. And that is why some soldiers never left the beach.